as well as what's going on in the chat pod, so do be aware of that. And last, I will be completing certificate of attendance for the group. So if you're interested, just keep my email handy there, the bcarruthers@air.org, and I'd be happy to send you the certificate for this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to our host, Cherise Moore. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Barb, for going over the requirements and how they can participate. As I was saying at the beginning, this is the webinar titled, You Have Your Title IV Financial Aid Accreditation, Now What? And we are very fortunate this afternoon to have presenting for us Mr. Dave Williams, who is the principal at Beaumont Adult School in Southern California. And Mr. Williams has gone through the COE and WASC accreditation, and so he's at a point where he can share that knowledge with you as colleagues so that hopefully it can benefit your programs. In doing that, today you're going to learn about completing some of the online applications for approval so that you can participate in the federal student financial aid programs. You're going to learn about the steps that are required to help you set up programs in your organization so that it can work most efficiently in an adult education environment. You're also going to learn about different options of funding that you can provide. And then finally, you're going to learn about training. In addition to his training and providing an overview and background for you on the next steps, you're going to also find out about where you can go to get training for your staff. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. David Williams, who is going to be facilitating the presentation this afternoon.
Thank you, Cherise. Welcome, everyone. Hopefully, we'll be able to provide you with with some information on the Title IV actually funding process. This is a basic introduction to the Title IV financial aid accreditation, or as I like to call it, show me the money. This is how you actually get into the process of being able to access the Title IV financial aid funds for your students and your programs. It is a very basic overview of the initial process of getting into your Title IV eligibility and setting up your financial aid organization within your schools. We're going to cover where and what is the Title IV electronic application, or EAP, and what resources are available to assist you in completing the application. What are the basic requirements for setting up your student aid organization, and what type of funding can you provide, and where you can get training for your staff. Again, this is going to be a very, very basic introduction to these topics to get you pointed in the right direction. When we started financial aid funding at our school, about 7 years ago, after we had our Title IV accreditation through WASC, we really had no idea of where to go after we had the accreditation and how to start getting our eligibility in place and being able to disperse the Title IV funds. A little bit of review from the previous webinar that we did in terms of the initial accreditation that makes you eligible for Title IV. You must have CTE certificate programs, must be at least 600 clock hours and 26 weeks in duration to be eligible. Agencies must have demonstrated a successful operation of a program for 24 consecutive months prior to initial accreditation. And the list of U.S. DOE recognized accrediting agencies for the purposes of Title IV funding can be found at the link on the presentation here. Basic timeline in terms of the accreditation process again, which is the first step prior to actually applying for the eligibility for financial aid. With the COE, the Council on Occupational Education, requires a letter of intent to COE, then followed by an application for candidacy from their documents that they have available online, a scheduled site visit to review the application for candidacy. Once that's completed, then their commission approves on a regular schedule all of the acceptance for candidacy or the regular accreditations in February, June, September, and November. Then you'll have at least 1 or 2 people required from your agency to attend one of their semi-annual conference workshops on the self-study process and how to put together your self-study for your actual accreditation visit. Once you've done that and you can schedule an accreditation visit, you will then have a preliminary visit by the team leader for the visiting committee about 6 to 8 weeks prior to your actual accreditation visit. Then they will accomplish the on-site accreditation visit. And following that, it goes back to the commission with the committee's recommendations for approval of your actual accreditation. So that can take anywhere from 1 year to approximately 2 or 2.5 years, depending upon how you want to establish the timeline for your self-study and final initial accreditation following the acceptance to candidacy. If you have any questions about that initial acceptance for candidacy and the initial accreditation process through the Council on Occupational Education, the webinar that was conducted earlier this year through CalPro can be viewed and listened to at the link on the CalPro website, the same link that's shown here on the PowerPoint. Just to try to get a feel for where people are at that are viewing and participating in the workshop today, shortly there'll be a survey screen that'll pop up asking where you're at or where is your agency in terms of the Title IV process. Are you still gathering information? Have you already started the accreditation process? Are you scheduled for acceptance to candidacy, or have you completed your initial accreditation? So Barbara, if you want to share that screen, I'd just like to get a feel for where people are that are in the participating audience so we can try and see what areas you might be most interested in terms of the financial aid process following your accreditation. Okay, well, I see we've got some that are still gathering the information about the Title IV process. A couple that have already started, and so I assume that means you started looking at your candidacy for accreditation. Okay. Well, that tells me a little bit more about where all of you are at in the process of this Title IV eligibility determination. The first thing we're going to look at, and what is really the first step in getting your eligibility and your approval for Title IV funds, is the application for approval to participate in the Federal Student Financial Aid Program, more commonly called in the financial aid services circles the EAP. The EAP may be accessed at the link that's shown there. We're also going to, when the webinar is done, you'll be able to download the EAP in a PDF format so you can see all of the material that's requested on the EAP. There's also information about applying for first-time approval at the link that's listed on the PowerPoint here. Barbara, if we could share that screen to show you just what you'll see when you go to the EAP application. I wanted everyone to try to get a look at that. This is the screen that you'll see when you go to that link that's on there. The EAP application, most of it goes in here. And over on the left-hand side, okay, unfortunately, one of the first things that we ran into when we started this application process a number of years ago is you can't get into the electronic version of the EAP until you obtain what's known as an OPE-ID. And we'll go through that as a little bit. The application is available in PDF format under the resources down here, so you will be able to download that, although you can also get a copy of it here. And it's actually required that you complete a portion of the paper EAP and fax it or email it to the school participation team so that they can send you the OPE ID that allows you entry into the electronic format for completion of the EAP. Over on the right, toward the right-hand side of the website, you can see that they list the student age school participation teams. We'll have that on another slide for you in a little better, larger format so you'll be able to see it. But there is a team that covers the West Coast, which includes all of California, that's home based out of San Francisco. And those will be one of the resources that you'll be wanting to contact in terms of going through your process for your initial eligibility and application. The EAP is fairly complex. When you get into it, if you look at the PDF format, you'll see some of the requirements that they have under the EAP are covered in your accreditation process. Others are not, that you'll have to establish yourself. Now, depending upon what type of program you're actually looking at providing for eligibility or Title IV funding for your CTE program, you may run into a situation where if you have a program such as a vocational nursing where there's a very distinct and clear state requirement in terms of instructional hours for completion of the program to meet eligibility for licensure, you won't have too much of a problem getting that program approved in terms of the U.S. Department of Education. If, on the other hand, you're looking at a program that does not have quite as a definitive amount of instructional time, but does provide a certificate of completion or eligibility or certification, that you may have to have a great deal of documentation prepared in order to provide that to the U.S. Department of Education to show that a program actually meets that 600 hours of instruction eligibility requirement. A good example we ran into was we incorporated a CNA program. We incorporated a certified nurse assistant program under our Title IV programs a couple of years ago. However, the state of California only requires 140 hours of instruction minimum for a certified nurse assistant. Obviously, that doesn't meet a 600-hour criteria. Over the years, we had added additional certifications to the basic CNA certification, which included home health aide, acute care CNA, and restorative nurses aide. Those certifications were based primarily on industry standards from various medical facilities, and we had to provide that documentation to the U.S. Department of Education in order for them to approve that program as a 600-hour Title IV eligible program. Okay, so Barbara, if we can go back to the screen with the PowerPoint, we'll go on a little bit more about the EAP and the eligibility. Minimum eligibility requirements, okay, those are the minimum ones, which include the 600-hour and the 2 year of operating prior to applying for eligibility. Most of those will be covered under your Title IV accreditation criteria. You must be able to prove financial responsibility for your organization. Okay, that means you're going to have to provide the 2 most recently completed fiscal years of audited financial statements. If you haven't run into that before, your district that you're associated with normally runs an audit in the district, and your business services office should be able to help you that you should be being audited under your district's audits on an annual basis. Those submissions are done electronically, and the auditors that work with your district under contract will be able to provide that and submit those electronically online so that they can see that you have the 2 years of audited financial statements. Just a word to the wise, and something we ran into, is that some school auditors don't recognize that Title IV programs have to be audited every year. Most federal grant programs and other federal programs only have to be audited once every 3 or 4 years, and we had to make sure that they knew that there was a special requirement for Title IV that they were audited on an annual basis so that they could be submitted, because this will go on even after you get your eligibility in terms of submitting audited information. You must show that your organization has sufficient administrative capability. A capable administrator, a system of internal checks and balances, frequent periodic reconciliation of internal records, a satisfactory academic progress policy, a refund policy, and you must submit your required annual financial statement audit on time. That was what I was referring to, and that the audit process goes on even after you determine your eligibility and start handling your financial aid funds. A capable administrator criteria generally means that you have to have one full-time administrator over the entire program that has completed the fundamentals of financial aid funding through the Department of Education training. And we'll get into that a little bit later to show you how you get somebody registered and to attend that training. You also have...
Dave, I'm going to jump in real quick. There was a question that was asked in the chat pod on who are they audited by, and is this typical?
Okay, your program normally should be audited by any capable licensed financial auditing firm. If you go to your district, the districts are typically audited every year and submit that as part of the funding for the state. Your programs are usually audited under those district policies by an outside auditor. In our case, the district contracts with an auditing firm that comes in and conducts the audits on an annual basis. They hold the audit records. The district submits them through your county Office of Education for verification of handling of financial funds from the state. Those same electronic audit documents can be submitted online through access that part of it was actually whether the easy audit was right there on that e-app page, but there'll be a place when you're doing the electronic application for those to be submitted electronically. So you would have to work with your district auditors, whoever that outside company might be, to establish with them the ability to submit those electronic audits. I know that's a little complicated, but that is typical for most school districts. And again, the only thing that's not typical in terms of Title IV is that it has to be done annually and submitted annually, whereas most federal programs under state public school systems are only audited once every 3 years, I believe it is. Did that answer the question? Okay, well, I hope it did. I know that's a little bit of a more complex, and it is a complex process, but the audits are just one of the many things that make it somewhat complex. Staying on this slide, the satisfactory academic progress policy and the refund policy are part of the accreditation process, and those will be looked at by your accrediting agency, which for us is the Council on Occupational Education, to ensure it meets the U.S. Department of Education requirements. There's also required that you submit the annual compliance audit. That's listed as an easy audit, although you may find it not quite so easy. But once you establish with your auditors for your district on doing that, it becomes not so such a complex process. The first couple times we had a little difficulty just because it was difficult to understand their process, but once you work with an auditing company and they submit, audits are done in a certain format and they submit them, then it's usually no problem. A policy that you use the electronic Title IV process. As of about 3 or 4 years ago, all of the handling of Title IV financial aid funding is done electronically. You'll pick up the requirements for this as you go through some of these U.S. Department of Education trainings in terms of what you need to do to establish that. But there is in the application, you have to submit basically that you agree to use the electronic Title IV processes in order to order and disperse Title IV financial aid funds. You have to have a policy in place that says you will notify the U.S. Department of Education within 10 days of substantive changes. That's also, although it doesn't specify U.S. Department of Education, your accrediting agency for Title IV purposes will generally require the same type of policy, that you notify them of any substantive changes to your programs. That can be anything from opening an additional campus or a remote site, to moving a campus to a different location, or wanting to add a different program than what was under your initial accreditation and eligibility. Okay. You complete the OPEID application to get your electronic access to the eApp, and that's part of that paper PDF eApp that will be downloadable here, in terms of completing the initial information and then emailing it or faxing it to the U.S. Department of Education School Participation Team for them to issue you an OPEID number. So that's part of why this process is so complicated, and as we found when we started through it, there's not a lot of people to help you out, although you can call that school participation team in San Francisco for just about anything and ask them a question, and generally they're extremely helpful in terms of answering it, but they may not take you to the next step. They'll answer your question, but they may not provide additional information unless you request it, so sometimes they're a little limited on that. Okay, resources for completing your eApp, and those were also on the eApplication website page. First, that Federal Student Aid Participation Team. The phone number is listed there. They are based in San Francisco. They do cover all of the West Coast, which includes all of California, obviously. There is another web page that's called the Information for Financial Aid Professionals, or IFAP. We've found that to be extremely helpful, not only in your initial application process, but as part of your ongoing financial aid management. It answers a lot of questions or provides you a lot of different resources through the web that you can access on that page. Okay, there are additional questions on the eApp. I think we're going to open up another chat pod so that you can put up some questions. I'll try and answer them as best as I can. Again, I realize this is a complex process, and everyone's program is going to be a little bit different. Although you have to go through the accreditation process, we have different CTE type of programs, and some of that will be applicable to how you fill out your eApp for your initial eligibility and how it's processed. But I'll see if I can't answer some of the questions that might come up on the eApp. Pardon me. There is one thing, and you didn't see it on the initial page, but you'll see it in both the paper version and when you get into the electronic version. There's another identification number called a DUNS number, which is D-U-N-S. You'll see it. I don't want you to be worried by it. Okay, there's a question. Still confused on how to get the OPEID. All right. Barbara, can you reshare that screen on the on the eApp application page? I know it may not be large enough for you to see when it comes up. Okay, on the left-hand side in the light blue column, it says information for initial applicant. Okay, that will take you to the IFAP page, which gives you that. And I'm looking for, there was a link. Perhaps it's on the IFAP page, which you may not be able to see here. but there is a link that says getting your initial OPE ID, and that is taken from that paper application, which is the application in PDF, that you complete the initial information for your school and email or fax that to the school participation team in San Francisco, and they'll review that and then issue you a OPE ID so that you may start your electronic process. Okay. Yeah, I know that's the hard part in terms of getting in there. And I realize it's difficult to be as clear in talking you through that as it is in terms of completing that and mailing it in. I hope that helps a little bit. Okay, I'm just trying to check and see if there was some additional items or questions on the a clarification on the EAP is the first step to qualify to be able to process financial aid. Okay, the EAP is the basis of getting your eligibility through the U.S. Department of Education. They have to approve your application, the EAP, in order for you to have a school code that goes into the FAFSA form that all students complete as part of the basic request for financial aid. Without that number for your school, you wouldn't be able to process the financial aid fund. So yeah, EAP is the first step in terms of qualifying after you have your accreditation that makes you eligible to apply for Title IV funding. The first step, okay, is the accreditation, because you cannot do this application for eligibility for financial aid until you have actually completed at least the initial acceptance to candidacy or interim accreditation from an agency that's recognized by the U.S. Department of Education. The only agency that we found that's available for those of us here that are public institutions on the West Coast is the Council on Occupational Education. There's a question on the time schedule. And in terms of completion and approval of the EAP, there is no definitive time schedule. In fact, we had a case in our school case where after the initial application was submitted, we received a provincial approval. And that was because we didn't have all of the audit information for our financial programs that the U.S. Department of Education required, or a provisional approval. It took about a year because we had to go through another auditing cycle to get the audits in the format that they wanted in order to get the final approval. So there is no definitive time limit, and each application will be processed separately by the U.S. Department of Education, and it can vary greatly between different applications. Accreditation, WASC no longer affiliates with the U.S. Department of Education for the purposes of accrediting for Title IV financial aid. They disaffiliated themselves in September of 2010. Previous to September 2010, it was possible to get a Title IV eligibility accreditation from WASC, but that is not the case now. WASC still does the academic accreditation for post-secondary adult schools and ROPs. However, they do not meet the requirements for Title IV eligibility. And if you want more information on that, we went through that in some detail in that initial webinar, which is posted on the CalPro website, so you can access more detailed information on that WASCWE process. When we started the initial process, the question is, now that we were approved, do we have to hire additional staff or assign staff exclusive to financial aid? When we were going through the initial accreditation process, we did bring in a new staff member who was experienced in federal financial aid and had worked with community colleges and universities on that to assist us in setting up a program. Initially, that was a part-time position. Even through the first couple of years of administering financial aid funds after we got our eligibility and we were able to issue financial aid funds, we did have a part-time person. As our program grew, we added additional vocational nursing classes in a cycle. We had more students. We were expanding into add a certified nurse assistant program under Title IV. We eventually trained someone within our staff that moved into a full-time financial aid technician or financial aid specialist position, and that is a full-time job that she has at our school, doing all of the financial aid functions for our career tech ed students in those programs. It takes some time. You want to make sure that you have somebody in terms of training somebody from the ground up. Or you can advertise and see about hiring somebody who already has an experience with Title IV, but you will require, in my opinion, at least one full-time financial aid technician or specialist in order to process everything that you need to have for running your financial aid program. Okay, and that's so that's pretty good. So I just briefly saw a question there about Dun & Bradstreet. I think that is where the DUNS number comes from. However, that number is actually issued through the electronic financial aid process. Once you get into that, there's a couple of different organizations within the Department of Education that handle the funding through that electronic process, and that's where you're issued the DUNS number, but that comes after you've gone through at least the initial application through the e-app, and you have to get that OPE ID. I just didn't want you, when you see it, it'll come up on your application, to be overly concerned about it initially. That will come somewhat later, but that'll actually be part of your financial aid process once you get going in it. Okay, and we're going to go into the next part. We'll be talking a lot about the training in terms of training your staff people, getting them trained, and keeping them up to date on the financial aid process. Unfortunately, what I've seen in the last 2 years is the financial aid process has been changing on an almost constant basis, requiring that personnel that are working in financial aid have to be continuously going to some sort of training or getting some sort of information in terms of keeping up with the changes that have been put into place by the Department of Education. For whatever reason, we've seen more changes in the Title IV financial aid process in the past 2 years than we had seen in the previous 4 years before that, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down much. But the basic requirements for your student aid organization, as I mentioned, a capable administrator, the CEO, or basically the school principal, director, or whoever's the lead administrator over those CTE programs, and the financial aid manager, whether you term it as a financial aid officer, manager, specialist, or technician, must attend the required U.S. Department of Education training. Barbara, if you could open that other share screen, that link that is on the PowerPoint will actually take you to it's actually a Dear Colleague letter from the U.S. Department of Education. We're going to show that to you now. You will have that as part of the downloads for the PowerPoint. But it shows all of the training for it's the one, right behind there, the FSA training workshops. There we go. It's a Dear Colleague letter This is how they issue information from U.S. Department of Education related to Title IV funding. This is a letter that contains the schedule for all of the federally sponsored U.S. Department of Education financial aid training for this forthcoming year. There are a number of different trainings which you may want to have either yourself or your staff participate in. I wanted to please have you take note. It says down here, please note that all fundamentals of federal student aid administration workshops beginning after October 1st, 2012. That's the one that are required for the chief administrator and the financial aid manager or specialist for your program. Must complete an online course titled Introduction to Federal Student Aid before registering for the Fundamentals of Federal Student Aid Administration workshops. The online course takes at least 20 hours to complete, so please plan accordingly. And that's something very new, as it says October 1st of this year. When I went through this training several years ago, that was not a requirement. However, you just had to register and take the training. Now, these trainings are free. Okay? The fundamentals of federal student aid administration, like all the other ones, is free, but it is only given in our region at the U.S. Department of Education office up in San Francisco, where that school participation team is located. So you don't pay for anything for the training other than the cost of sending your people to attend the training up in San Francisco. There is, several years ago, the CEO or chief administrator for the programs was only required to do 3 days of the 5 days of training. Now I understand, if you could scroll down a little bit farther in the letter, Barbara, we can actually get down to where you can see where the scheduling is. There are a number of questions that are in the letter that should be able to answer. If you see, okay, March of this coming year, March 4th through 8th, 2013, is the one in San Francisco. And they have a later one in September in San Francisco also. I don't think anybody wants to go to Seattle or Denver, although you could theoretically if you wanted to. So most of us attend the trainings that are done in San Francisco. Those now require that both the administrator and the financial aid manager attend the full 4 days of the training. Okay, and it is a very intensive training. Some of what we're talking about here today, very briefly, they will spend anywhere from half a day to a full day just covering in great detail that particular aspect of your financial aid organization in terms of how to set it up and how to properly operate it for Title IV purposes. So it goes through quite a number of things, but it is just the basics. Okay. All right, Barbara, if we could go back to the slide for the PowerPoint. Again, you will have that letter, so you'll have it to read in detail and go over after the PowerPoint, after the webinar today. You can take that with you. And shows you how to go through the registration and get into that process. You must be able to show a division of functions in awarding and dispersing aid. That means that you can't have the same person determining eligibility of students for financial aid and then ordering, which is the award, basically, is determining the eligibility for financial aid, and that same person dispersing aid. You have to have a division of functions in there. In our case, in our working through our district and our organization, we have our financial aid specialist who does the interviews and assists the students with completing their FAFSA, gathers the information, and makes the determination of what financial aid award they're eligible for. Then if the student decides to enroll and wants to apply that award toward their education and in our programs, that she orders the money from U.S. Department of Education through that electronic process. The funds are basically awarded and ordered by individual, so it is per student. Okay, however, those funds are then received by our district office and business services and credited to the students' accounts, and essentially they're dispersed to the school through our business services office at the district. In some cases, a student may actually have an award in excess of the cost of the tuition or fees for your program. Those students are entitled for that money to receive that money personally. If there is an overage of financial aid, that's also a dispersal. We do that through our school secretary who handles the student accounts. And then if there is any overage of financial aid funds, we issue those directly in the form of a check through our district, and our site school secretary does the accounting on that and issues the checks to the students so that they have the funds themselves. Some schools have gone to doing that electronically where they can make direct deposits to student accounts. We've just found it with our students. Many of them don't have the capability of receiving direct deposit, and we didn't want to go with one of those companies that issued them Visa or prepaid cards based on their disbursement or their reimbursement amount, so we just do it in the form of a check. But that is the division of functions, and again, at that basic financial aid training up in San Francisco, they spend over a day just going through this division of functions process for your organization. So it's they're very adamant about it, and it is fairly critical that you establish your organization that way. Okay, the types of financial aid that you can provide. And once you've received your eligibility for Title IV federal financial aid, basically any of the financial aid programs that are offered by the federal government, your school can process. Most of us limit ourselves to the Pell Grants. Most of the adult schools and ROPs that I've talked with and viewed over the years only want to be able to do Pell Grants for their students, and that's understandable. The processes and eligibility are still the same. However, there's a few things you don't have to worry about if you're only doing Pell Grants. The fact that the students don't incur any personal debt as a result of the Pell Grants makes some of the administration and oversight of the program somewhat less complex. However, the eligibility is still the same. Once you have that eligibility, your school can do Pell Grants and do federal student loans. Okay, and they'll explain those to you at the fundamentals of financial aid training up there in San Francisco, but there are several different types of student loans, and I'm not talking about the Sallie Mae type of private loans. These are provided through different loan agencies, but with the guarantee of the federal government, and is processed through the financial aid electronic process. So there are several different types of student loans there, but you can provide those student loans for your students in addition to Pell Grants. There's no difference in the eligibility. There is a little more work and a little some additional things you have to do in terms of your organization to be able to provide those, but nothing else is required. The other two I put on there just as an example. The same financial aid that many of the colleges and universities provide, the FWS is the Federal Work-Study Grant. If you had a situation where you had a work-study program where a student could perform some sort of work for the school in a job such as parking attendant, library attendant, something like that, and receive fund for it, there's a matching type of grant under financial aid called the Federal Work-Study Grant. Most of us don't do that. However, the eligibility is the same. You have the eligibility for financial aid funding. You can provide that. Another one is the TEACH grant, which is directed towards candidates for a teaching credential that are going to work in Title I schools, low socioeconomic areas, and meet eligibility. Again, unless you have a teacher credential program, you're not going to want to offer that particular grant. Which, to my knowledge, none of us have for the adult schools or RLPs in California. But I wanted to show as an example that once you have your eligibility for Title IV financial aid, you can offer any of these different types of grants. or loans. Again, Pell Grant being the primary one that most agencies are looking at in providing funds to their students for both materials and for tuition. There are some other organizations that provide financial aid training. The one that we utilize, the one I'm most familiar with, is the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. Now, that is a membership organization, and there is a cost in terms of getting a membership in the organization. However, we found that the NASFA is really very helpful, in fact, almost critical in terms of making sure that we are up to date with everything that comes from the U.S. Department of Education in terms of required compliance and handling of student financial aid. There is a link for NASFA that's in the PowerPoint here. The cost for a membership in NASFA is based partly on the size of program that you have, the number of full-time equivalent students that you have in your program. Basically for us, it's about $1,200 a year. There is an institutional membership or an individual membership. You can decide which one works best for you. We found, mostly because our district wouldn't pay for individual memberships, that an institutional membership works just as well, but it allows both myself and my financial aid specialist to receive the services from the NASFA organization. They hold a couple of national conferences on financial aid administration every year, and they're extremely good in terms of providing workshops and training for financial aid administrators and financial aid managers. That, just like most of the conferences associated with education, there is some additional cost to attend the conference with all of the workshops and presentations. However, you have to be a member, and they don't accept people outside of their organization for their national conferences. A subsidiary of the NASFA organization is the California Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or CASFA. If you join NASFA, you automatically have a membership in CASFA. That is the same organization, but on a local level within the state of California. They do hold a number of trainings, workshops, conferences throughout the state of California every year, and to most of my knowledge, that once you are a member through NASFA, that there generally is not any additional charge for these trainings that are conducted in various locations around California. We use those a lot with our financial aid specialists and staff members in sending them to those more local conferences and workshops to get up-to-date information on the federal financial aid process. So those are two of the outside organizations, in addition to the U.S. Department of Education training that's offered every year, that we utilize in order to make sure our people are trained in meeting the requirements of student financial aid. And those would be ones that I would recommend to anyone. Okay, we're going to open it back up for questions, but one of the other things that I wanted to mention about the training process, whether it's through NASFA, CASFA, or through the U.S. Department of Education in San Francisco, all of the financial aid managers and technicians that I've met over the years establish a network through these trainings. They really meet other financial aid people from other parts of the state or in other states. If you attend the training in San Francisco, there's going to be a lot more organizations than just public schools up there. There could be colleges and universities. There's an awful lot of the private for-profit institutes, whether they're at a university level or whether they're at a local barber college level, that you meet in these trainings. And people who work in financial aid generally establish a pretty big network, because we've really found that nobody actually knows everything there is to know about financial aid. And frequently these professionals in financial aid, from whatever sector they come from, rely on each other in terms of providing information. So if they have questions about how to do things, they will contact each other to see how other organizations are doing them And that's one of the most effective ways that they've found, and I see that they do that. I see one question that having financial aid has made a significant impact and improvement for your school. Yes. In our case, Beaumont Adult School, when we started the vocational nursing program in 2004, our cap on ADA from the state apportionment was about 95 ADA. There was absolutely no way, based upon the cost of a 17-month vocational nursing program, that we could sustain a CTE program without financial aid or without charging our students tuition. In fact, it was really, really difficult to make that 24 months of operating our program without having the financial aid before we were eligible for it. We actually, our students had to get Sallie Mae and private loans in order to pay the tuition, and we only ran one class, and it was quite a complex budgetary nightmare. That since we've gotten the financial aid, both the accreditation eligibility, and begin to distribute the funds, it's made a significant difference. We now run 3 concurrent classes of vocational nurses. We've added the certified nurse assistant curriculum under the Title IV. We had run that for a number of years before, but not under eligibility for Title IV. Basically, at the time, as I said, when we started the nursing program, our total school allocation from the state was about $250,000. Back in 2004, this year, our projected budget for the school is about $2.2 million. About 70% of that comes from the Title IV financial aid programs for our CTE programs. So yes, it has made a very significant impact. It has allowed us that even during this time of budgetary crisis that the adult schools and RLPs are going through, that as we were, before we even got into the budget crisis, we had shifted a great deal of the administrative overhead of the school to be supported under the Title IV programs. Now, you have to maintain separation between your financial aid funds for your CTE programs and funding for your any other adult programs that you're operating through the school. However, most administrative functions share some portion of that. My salary, a significant portion of it, is covered by the CTE program and the financial aid fund, so it reduces the amount of impact on what other funding we have for our general adult ed programs. Same thing with most of my staff. The majority of our staff members have some portion of their salaries paid under the Title IV because they perform some function for support of our students in the CTE programs, even all the way down to a custodian. That reduces a great deal of the overhead cost for the school, so that allows us that even as we've had budget reductions in terms of state allocations and local funding, we've been able to keep most of our general adult ed programs because of the reduced overhead costs that we're able to maintain with the CTE programs in Title IV.
All right, Dave, we are at about 2 minutes to 3, and so being that I don't see any other questions coming up, I'm going to help us get to some of your handouts here on our closing slide. Barb, if you could get that there, get that up for me, that would be great. Thank you all very, very much for participating today. We had a small but intimate group, and I think that you were able to get a lot of your questions answered directly as a result of that, so I'm really pleased about that. Dave is an expert in financial aid, and we certainly appreciate his experience and his willingness to share honestly the impacts it has had on his school and his program, and the benefits it's had on his school and program as well. We are going to provide you with the PowerPoint. If you look on the bottom left side of your screen in the middle area, you will see that we have several documents available for you to download. If you just want to click on the file and then click Save to My Computer, once you've clicked on it, you can download the electronic application PDF. the initial electronic application information PDF, the PowerPoint that you've just gone through, as well as the letter that has the training dates that are coming up for those of you who will need to be preparing for training. And if there are any final questions, you can type those to in slide 16, which is on the upper right side of your screen. I'm going to invite you to take our survey and give us some feedback about your participation in today's webinar. That link is on the bottom right of your screen. And then finally, I'm going to invite you to join us tomorrow at 2 o'clock. We have another administrators webinar, and that webinar is on NCAP, the National Career Awareness Project. And if you're not familiar with that project, it was a project funded by the Office of Vocational and Adult Education, and we offered it as a pilot in several schools throughout the state of California. And in that, programs learned about a tool, the NCAP tool, that actually provides lessons, in-depth lessons for you to work with your staff on in terms of building career awareness into your curriculum. And it's a really great tool, great resource. And if you are a smaller program and might not have access to a counselor, this is going to really be something of benefit for you. And even if you are a larger program, the tools that are available through the NCAP program really, I think, would help your counselors to even expand the work that they're doing. So I see one more question that was added there by Diana. The biggest change is that you add enrollment because of more classes, and she's asking that as a question, Dave, and I'll give you a moment to respond. And while he's doing that, if you want to, again, download the attachments and respond to our survey, and we are going to be closing out here shortly. Dave, you can go ahead and respond to that.
Okay, thanks, Sharice. I do see the question there. The biggest change in that we added enrollment because of more classes, yes and no. Yes, we did add more enrollment because we expanded the program. The CTE students attend on a much more regular and more frequent basis, so the amount of hours in terms of ADA is much higher in CTE per student than it is in most of your general adult programs. However, while that made a change for the school, and it certainly is a difference in terms of the balance of students that we have at the school, it did not significantly, although it did initially for a couple of years when we had AB 23 growth potential through for general state apportionment. We did get some growth. We actually grew from that 95 ADA cap up to when they put us at the 07-08 baseline under categorical flexibility, we were up to 196 ADA, so we actually more than doubled the state apportionment in that time. A lot of it was due to the fact that we were putting the CTE students through the program, and they were acquiring much more ADA hours for those programs than our regular adult programs. But the fact is that most of our CTE programs run entirely on tuition and fees. The vocational nursing program is a very expensive program, 17 months in length, about 1,600 hours of instruction over that 17 months, requires a lot of equipment, a lot of things. We actually purchase laptop computers for our students, and they come into the vocational nursing program just like we do a textbook. But we've shifted a lot of the content and curriculum materials over to either DVD, CD, or online materials. So rather than purchase books and have to carry them around, they have their laptops that they can use. But those programs are very expensive, so that the budget for those programs has grown to about $1.5 million per year from what it was 8 years ago when we were barely getting by, and quite frankly, the first class that went through probably didn't receive the greatest education in terms of vocational nursing because of the extent of restricted budgeting that we had for that program. So once we had the availability of funds, not only were we able to expand the programs to offer to more students, we were able to provide more for the programs, both in technology, content, curriculum, and experience.
All right. So Thank you again, Dave. I really, really appreciate that. And everyone else, I see that you're having some trouble with the PowerPoint, Diana. Barb, if you can help Diana with that, you can email her separately and she will get you the PowerPoint, Diana. Third attachment is the PowerPoint one, so that seems to be the one that we're having a little bit of trouble with. So Barb has everyone's information and she will ask you to email her and she will get it out to you. And Barb, if you can type in your email address one more time, that would be great. Perfect. Thank you so much again. Dave, thanks again for your time today. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and we will look forward to seeing you join us again soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.